Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to give a list of some unique fantasy book recommendations. And while I am somebody who I love cozy fantasy, I love fantasy where it makes me feel nostalgic even if it's something new, or I like when authors are taking a concept we've seen before, a fantasy archetype of a character we've seen before, and they do something fresh and unique with it. While I like all of that, every now and then I'm in the mood for a fantasy story that just feels unlike anything else I've ever picked up. And whether they end up being new favorites or not, at the end of the day, I always respect when authors are willing to try something new and are willing to really dive into the creativity. It's those kinds of stories that I think really push the boundaries of what fantasy can be. And I think that's very true of this first book, which would be Gideon the Ninth. Gideon the Ninth is in some ways almost more science fiction than fantasy, and then in other ways it's more mystery than in fantasy, but then at its core you're like, no, this is a fantasy story. And the tagline, the thing that has been said in the marketing, is that it's necromancers in space, which is not untrue, but I think that's such a brief way of describing it that it doesn't quite capture everything that you're actually going to get with this story. And what's interesting about this is in hearing people talk about it, I would hear people say, oh, it's convoluted, oh, it's kind of confusing, it's hard to keep track of what's going on. And that led me to believe I was going to get a certain thing out of this. I thought this was going to be the kind of story where it's heady and abstract, and I didn't even really feel like I had my feet on the ground. That's not exactly what I found was the case. So the setup is that you have necromancers in space, you have these different houses, and we are looking at the ninth house. And there is a necromancer in this house who is trying their best to keep everything under control. And they end up going to this place to almost, you could say, compete to ascend to immortality, we'll say. In that sense, you could say that's the plot, but you also really don't quite know, as that's not the character you're following. You are following that character's cavalier, whose name is Gideon. Gideon hates the necromancer that she is protecting, but she really doesn't have a means of escaping her life and making anything for herself, of herself, unless she agrees to accompany the necromancer. So she does, and the reason that this ends up being somewhat complex and convoluted is because Gideon doesn't know anything really when it comes to necromancy. Nobody's cluing her in as to this mystery that's going on in this place that she has to go to. So she's just kind of there and then gets swept into everything. And I'm really actually, at the time I'm filming this, I've not yet picked up the sequel, and there's more books than just the second one, but I'm actually really looking forward to jumping into that, as I've heard that it gives you a new perspective on everything once you've read further on. And I'm really excited because, one, that's a very in and of itself unique reading experience for a book series, but just in general, when I finished reading this, I was like, this is unlike anything I've picked up before. And I kind of liked following a character who it felt in some ways like we weren't following the main character, is what it felt like. And so we were kind of like, wait, I guess they're trying to solve this situation and figure this out. I don't really know, but I'm with Gideon. I'm just like, whatever, okay, I guess we're here. And Gideon also is an extremely entertaining character to follow. This does have a little bit of a niche humor to it, but that ended up working really well for me. So I've described this to my friends, my husband, as Trevor Belmont from the Castlevania Netflix show. If Trevor Belmont was a book, I feel like he would be Gideon the Ninth. The tone, the sort of himbo effect, if you will, of this is just so unlike anything I've come across. And if you're curious, the humor is funny because the writing is really good. The descriptions are fantastic, and it has almost this posh feeling to it. And then the humor is so stupid at times that the contrast, one, is funny, and then other times you're almost astounded at how dumb the humor is. Which, I can be very picky about humor, I can be very picky about dumb humor, but in this one, it was like the juxtaposition made it that much funnier. It made it that much more clever. I really liked it. I can't wait to read more. And if you're looking for something that is truly unlike basically anything that you've probably experienced before in fantasy, check out Gideon the Ninth. Speaking of things that are unlike probably most other things you've experienced, we have Piranesi. Piranesi, many of you know if you watch fairly regularly, didn't actually end up working for me. And in the end, I really quite disliked it, but not because I thought it was poorly written and not because I was offended by anything. It's nothing like that. It's just, it's so confusing, disorienting, complex. You don't feel like you know if everything that's happening is actually happening. Are you actually trapped in someone's mind who doesn't have a firm grasp on reality? It's so out there that for that reason, I respect this book and I definitely will continuously recommend it because truly there's been probably no other book that has created the reading experience that Piranesi did. And a lot of people find it extremely moving. I think there are aspects to it that are touching on philosophy and kind of the concept of the cave analogy, if you know that from any kind of philosophical, if you took classes in high school or anything like that, that touch on these sorts of things. Just the beauty of our existence. And it's interesting in that if you're asking yourself, like, what's the plot of Piranesi? I can describe it to you, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if you know the plot or not. So the main character is somebody who, it would seem, is in another world and not our own world. You don't know if this is of their own making, if it's all in their mind, if they're dreaming, or if they truly did go through some kind of portal. But it seems like they are losing their sanity. And so you are following them as you potentially are watching them spiral or try to grapple with what is real and what is not, and if they're going to be able to escape this place that they're in. It also has commentary on isolation, and it's truly unlike anything I've ever picked up before. After that, the next book is one that was another reason I wanted to make this video. I was doing an anticipated releases video not that long ago, and the sequel to this book is coming out soon. At the time I'm filming this, it's not yet out. And it just reminded me how unique of a book this really was, and that would be Strike the Zither. This story follows two rival, they are strategists. And what's interesting and fun about that is you are following one strategist, and when they meet another strategist, they can't ever know if the information that that strategist is telling them is true, or if that person is telling them something that's maybe a half-truth, or if it's a lie, and they're hoping that the main character won't be able to discern that, and that they will bring the wrong information back to the individual they serve. So that alone, I was like, oh, that sounds like it's going to be so interesting, fun, that you're going to be constantly on the edge of your seat because you're wondering, wait, was that a lie? Was that true? And while I did enjoy that, I can't tell you why, I can't tell you how, I can't give any specifics, but just know that while that is not untrue, and that is what you get for a part of this story, at some point this becomes a very different story. The only thing I can think of that's even somewhat similar, and I read this years and years ago, I need to reread it, but The Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor, it had a similar feeling of, oh, I guess this is way different than I thought we were going to get. And that feeling of the story just going in a direction you would have probably never predicted is why I really wanted to include it today, because I don't think there have been too many other books, except for maybe Daughter of Smoke and Bone, where I have been taken aback with how I was not prepared for what we were going to get. A subversion of expectations, you could say. Speaking of Laini Taylor, I did want to bring her up just because truly when it comes to creativity, when it comes to just a brilliant mind that seems to think of things that don't feel rooted in anything we've seen before, and that has whimsy, and it's grim and it's morbid, but it's beautiful. I don't think too many other books capture that quite the way that Strange the Dreamer does. This story follows a young man named Laszlo Strange. I'm sure you've heard about it. It was a booktube darling for so long. It's one of my favorites. And Laszlo is somebody who, he believes that this make-believe place that everybody is convinced is fiction. He's like, no, I believe it's real, and he's researching everything he can on this place that's known as Weep, and then one day he has the opportunity to find out if Weep is indeed real or not. And then you go to another perspective, and that perspective is of a girl who seems to be stuck somewhere with some other people, and they're all blue. And when I say blue, I mean literally they are blue, not they're feeling down. They're blue, and you're like, why are they blue? What's going on? And you kind of just follow along these two characters' lives until you're figuring they're going to intertwine. And then you pick up the second book and you're like, okay, I think I know a little bit more of what's going on. And then suddenly, so it's not just Strange the Dreamer, but it's sequel Muse of Nightmares. You start Muse of Nightmares and you're like, who are these people? And you get introduced to new characters and it feels like it's completely out of left field. I honestly, when I picked it up, I thought, oh no, is this going to tank? Is this going to become a waste of time? I really was very hesitant, and the way everything comes together is so heartbreaking, but so powerful and so beautiful. And the arcs that these characters have are fantastic. And if you're somebody who likes exploring morality, if you like exploring compassion, if you like seeing characters that at surface level seem one way, but then the more you get to know them, the more your whole view of everything shifts, Strange the Dreamer, I highly recommend. The last few I'm just going to give a brief overview for, as I've mentioned these quite a few times over the last year or so, two of them specifically because they came out not that long ago. But first we have The Bone Orchard. This one is unique in its reading experience and in its setting. So you follow this character who, at first, you're like, okay, I'm following this character. But then very quickly you feel disoriented because you're like, wait, who are they? What's their name? It sounds like they're being referred to as something else. And you gather that it would seem this individual has fractured themselves into different beings based off of different personality traits or different trauma that they have experienced. So they've literally separated themselves, and they have a means of doing this where they can create bodies that they can put these other things into, yet they still kind of think of themselves as one, which you're like, okay, I gotta adjust here, hold on, because that's a very odd character protagonist to be with. Protagonists, single. It's like one of those instances where you have protagonist and then you need parentheses with an S because it's like kind of multiple, kind of one. And you're exploring why this character has fractured themselves and the world itself and how they're able to do this. And you kind of dissect. It's like a really deep character study that by the time you get to the end, it does make you look back and see everything a little differently. And when I first read it, the reading experience was, I wouldn't say it was a lovely or pleasant time by any means. I didn't like feeling so off balance, but once I had some time away from it, I found I kind of couldn't stop thinking about it, and that in the end, it was quite powerful and it was quite moving. And it's one of these stories that I want to go back and reread someday just because it was so different, it was so unique, and I think it was, what it was saying was quite deeply moving. And then from there, we have The Bone Shard Daughter, so another one with bone in the name. And then we have City of Nightmares. I talked about City of Nightmares quite a bit because I read it and its sequel last year, and I had such a good time with this story. It is extremely morbid and extremely funny at the same time. You are following a young woman who is terrified as in her society, which is kind of like Gotham if Gotham was tripping on acid. So you have a city where people's nightmares, they can turn into their nightmares, and they have developed a means to keep this from occurring, but it does still occur from time to time. Our main character, her sister, when she was young, turned into a nightmare, which manifested as this giant spider. That giant spider killed her dad, and then it was killed by some task forces that were designed to take out nightmares. And so our main character has been traumatized by this, understandably so, for basically her whole life. She has found a group that she can work for, and they're supposed to help victims of nightmares. And by that, I don't mean that she is being helped by them. She's supposed to now help other people, but she's the worst at her job because she's terrified still. And she mostly is just working for these people so she can feel as though she's got some kind of safe haven. And even though the book is really morbid and weird, I actually feel like it did a great job of showing PTSD, of showing the ways in which sometimes logically you know one thing, but your body reacts a certain way. It's just almost innate for it to feel certain ways because of what's going on around you. And so you explore that throughout this duology. And I also just think that the world building, you could call it, it's kind of hard to describe it as world building because it feels different than how we usually use that word. But the world building in association with the nightmares I thought was really interesting, and it's super funny. It's a good time. Our main character, her place of work, everybody's like, you know that's a cult, right? And she's like, no, it's not a cult. And everybody's like, it's a cult. It's a cult. It's a weird book, but I had a lot of fun with it. And it seems like it's having a lot of fun too. It's ridiculous. And then last, The Bone Shard Daughter. This is a completed trilogy, so as is City of Nightmares, that's a completed duology. Strange Dreamers, a completed duology. So a fair amount of these, if you do want to pick them up, you've got the rest of the series too, which is really exciting. The Bone Orchard is a standalone. But anyway, The Bone Shard Daughter, we follow a few different perspectives. One, this is unique in that some of the perspectives are first person, some are third person, which I did not think I would like. But when I was reading it, I didn't even notice for a while. I was like, wait, oh, there's different uses of perspective. I didn't realize that. So I really actually think the author did it masterfully and seamlessly. And then on top of that, it's unique because of just its setup and its magic is so cool. So the main perspective in the first book, we have Lynn, who is the daughter of the Emperor. The Emperor uses bone shard magic to create these beings known as constructs who do his bidding, basically. He's the only person really who can control them and who has this magic. He is trying to teach Lynn how to use this magic. However, Lynn has a lot of gaps in her memory. She doesn't know why. So she's trying to gain the ability to use this magic while simultaneously trying to solve the mystery of what happened to her and why she can't seem to remember past a certain point. And it actually has a lot of science fiction and horror leanings in this first book. I do think books 2 and 3 definitely become more fantasy leaning. So if you are going into this trilogy hoping it's going to get more and more horror leaning, not so much. I would say something like Justice of Kings is one that has a lot of morality questioned, and then as you go throughout that series, it gets more and more horror leaning. This is different. It gets more and more fantasy leaning, I would say. But this first book was really a staple of this video, quite unique. And I really just enjoyed also one of the other perspectives named Jovis. I thought Jovis was kind of a lighthearted character that was needed for this, as a lot of the rest of it is very serious and dark. That's it though for some unique fantasy book recommendations. If you have any of your own recommendations, definitely feel free to leave those in the comments. But thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and if you pick any of these up, I hope you really like them. But I'll see you later.